Hi class, welcome to Bearded Debate. My name is Josh Patterson and we're going to be using the Toulmin model to run a solvency argument from the negative perspective. First off, let's just talk about what the Toulmin model is real quick. The Toulmin model consists of a claim, which is kind of like your statement of opinion, the grounds, which is your evidence supporting your claim, and your warrant, which is your summary of what that evidence means in relation to your claim. So you're trying to support your claim with that evidence and you're explaining what that means. So let's go on to how I like to see this expressed. Um, we call this the Toulmin model remix. And this is where you'll say, they say, we say, evidence, impact. And you don't have to say, they say, we say, evidence, and impact when you're giving the speech. This is just how you structure your argument. So you might say, the affirmative team wants you to believe that. Instead, we're going to run a solvency argument against their contention 3, subpoint A, where we say this, and here's our evidence that supports that, and here's why it matters. So that's kind of how this goes. And the idea is that you give a argument or a counter argument to a specific claim that the affirmative team has made. This way, it's very clear to your judges. They know exactly what you're trying to say, what you're arguing against, and you get to the point. I have an example argument here where the 1AC is an implicit bias 1AC. And the idea of this case is that implicit bias training helps drastically improve police community relations. So, the affirmative team makes this claim. With the federal government support, IBT or implicit bias training drastically improves police community relations. Evidence. Turn to Whitfield 2019. Read the evidence, or the affirmative team has read the evidence. And then they say, as you can see, IBT improves police relations with communities and reduces escalation. But now, what do you do when it comes to running an argument against this from a negative perspective? Well, I have some negative evidence built into this slide for my students already. So you can click on this negative evidence. It will take you to um, a brief essentially on implicit bias training from a negative perspective. It's got definitions in case you don't know. I think this is from the NDCA group. And here's an example of an argument saying that it won't solve. So here we just have what looks like a claim. We have the author of the evidence, and we have the evidence right here. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to use that they say, we say evidence impact, and I'm going to start by saying the affirmative wants you to believe that implicit bias training helps build relationships with communities. However, we believe that the affirmative team can't get solvency. We believe that a lack of oversight means implicit bias training fails, and implementing this from a federal government perspective makes it so that lack of oversight is obvious. Turn to James 2017. Although nearly everyone I spoke with about the training seemed to take pains to avoid one word, racism. That's the kind of bias that was on everybody's mind. It's just something that you don't admit. It's the elephant in the room that you just don't talk about, said Sergeant Sam Wolf, another trainer in the department. You don't talk about discrimination and bias because then people might think cops are discriminatory. They're biased. If we admit that, then what does it mean about how we serve the public? The morning's class was only the third to be offered in Salt Lake, but it puts the department among a growing number of adopting similar courses, generally referred to as implicit bias training. In at least 4 states, state police and their training academies offer the classes, as do local departments in more than a dozen. But even as the classes spread, it's not clear whether or not they actually work. Few specific guidelines exist for what courses should include, how the material should be taught, or how it measures its effects. Indeed, little data exists about their efficacy over the long term. The Obama administration task force on 21st century policing included implicit bias training on its list of best practices for law enforcement without specifics. That ambiguity leaves each agency to decide what the classes should look like and whether or not they're succeeding. As you can see, Judge, the affirmative team can't get solvency. There's no way to measure the long-term impacts of this, whether or not it will work. It's already something being done and suggested as a best practice. And even with that, there's such a lack of oversight that we're not seeing a clear direction or success for implicit bias training. With that, I hope you vote negative on solvency. Moving on to my next argument. Cut. So this is an example of using the Toulmin model to make a negative argument against an affirmative argument. The affirmative team is claiming that they can solve with a piece of evidence. We're claiming they can't solve with a piece of evidence that directly attacks what they're trying to say. Now, in my class, I have my students go through this same process where they will make an argument and they can use this piece of evidence. They could say almost exactly what I said. At first, it's all about getting the reps in. It's about practicing correctly, and then eventually the students will think critically about arguments being made, find evidence or do research to counter that claim, and make their own arguments. Someone else has already done this work for them, and this is a good way to practice correctly what it's supposed to be like. Here's another solvency argument led by violent officers. Relations are too damaged already. So, and then some other, alt cause arguments, and there's a lot of other arguments in this brief. But you get the idea. Thank you. Have a good day.